An arrogant customer humiliates a cashier with Down syndrome right in the middle of the supermarket, drowning him in cruel words just because he isn't working fast enough. The crowd remains silent. No one dares to speak up. But what the bully doesn't know is that Big Shaq is watching. And when a real man steps up, justice will be served. Where are you watching this video from? Comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to spread justice. Inside Freshmart Supermarket, another busy morning unfolds. The air hums with activity, the chatter of customers, the rhythmic clatter of shopping carts rolling over tiled floors, and the steady beeping of barcode scanners at the checkout counters. At the far end of the store, Register 5 has just opened. Behind the counter stands a young man with soft brown curls and a lean 5 feet 9 inches frame. His hands are clasped tightly together, his bright eyes filled with excitement, yet laced with nervous anticipation. Ethan Walker, 22, has Down syndrome, but he has never let that stop him from living a normal life. Today is his first day on the job, a milestone he has worked hard to reach. He has prepared diligently, reading and rereading the training manual all night, practicing scanning milk cartons at home, even imagining different customer interactions. But now, standing in front of the real thing, a wave of anxiety runs down his spine. A gentle hand rests on his shoulder. Ethan flinches slightly, then turns to meet the kind gaze of Mark Simmons, the store manager. A middle-aged man with graying hair, a warm smile, and the kind of face that radiates genuine care. Mark is one of the rare bosses who truly values his employees. "Welcome to the team, Ethan. We're really happy to have you here." The words warm Ethan's heart. He grips Mark's hand firmly, offering a bright, determined smile. "I'll do my best, sir." For Ethan, this isn't just a job. It's a chance to prove that he can do it, that he's not so different from everyone else. But not everyone sees it that way. At Register 4, Jason, a cashier who has worked at Freshmart for nearly 3 years, glances over at Ethan, then shrugs. Leaning toward his coworker, he murmurs under his breath, "Think he can actually handle it? Look at him. He's already shaking." The female cashier beside him simply gives a small shake of her head, casting a doubtful glance in Ethan's direction but saying nothing. Ethan doesn't catch the words, but he feels the weight of their stares. A flicker of doubt creeps into his mind, but he quickly takes a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. "It's okay. Just follow what I practiced. I can do this." Mark gives Ethan one last encouraging pat on the back before heading to his office, leaving the young man alone to face his first real challenge. Ethan straightens his uniform, squares his shoulders, and places his hand on the scanner. It's time to begin. Ethan gripped the edge of the checkout counter tightly, feeling every irregular beat of his racing heart. No matter how much he tried to steady himself, the overwhelming sounds around him, the steady beeping of barcode scanners, the hurried footsteps of customers weaving past one another, the distant chatter from adjacent registers, all merged into an invisible pressure wrapping around his mind. He knew he needed to focus, to recall everything he had been trained to do, to scan the barcodes, to bag the groceries carefully. But his hands no longer felt like his own. The motions he had practiced over and over now felt clumsy, sluggish, betraying him when he needed them most. At Register 4, Jason, a seasoned cashier, had just finished his transaction and turned to glance at Ethan's register. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his chest, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. Standing next to him was Rachel, another cashier, her petite frame and ponytail giving her an unassuming presence. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes flickered with a hint of hesitation. Jason tilted slightly toward Rachel, his voice not particularly loud but deliberately audible to those nearby, a way of ensuring his words reached their intended target. "He's so slow. I don't know if he's cut out for this." Rachel shot a brief glance at Ethan, then gave a small shrug. Her voice was soft, not entirely agreeing, but not defending him either. "It's kinda sad, but yeah, maybe this job isn't for him." Jason let out a scoff, shaking his head in mock exasperation, his gaze never leaving Ethan, as if waiting for the inevitable mistake. "He's gonna mess up sooner or later. Just watch." Ethan heard them. He didn't need to turn around to feel their eyes on him, their whispers slicing through him like sharp needles piercing the fragile armor of confidence he was, desperately trying to build. He knew they were waiting for him to fail, already seeing him as someone who didn't belong, someone out of place in a job that demanded speed and precision. But Ethan forced himself not to dwell on it. He pressed his lips together, willed himself to stay calm, to focus on the task at hand, to ignore the weight of their judgment. But how could he ignore it when, right in front of him, a middle-aged woman with neatly styled curls and a beige overcoat kept glancing at her watch, shaking her head in visible impatience? She said nothing at first, but the displeasure in her eyes spoke louder than words. A heavy sigh escaped her lips, one that carried the unmistakable frustration of someone who believed even a minute of waiting was too much to ask. Ethan tried to speed up, to concentrate harder, but his tension only made his hands more unsteady. As he carefully picked up a box of cereal to place it into the grocery bag, it slipped slightly from his grasp, landing on the counter with a soft thud. Immediately, the woman blinked and let out another, more pronounced sigh. "Oh, for God's sake," she muttered, just loud enough for those around to hear. She wasn't the only one. Behind her, a man in a light blue dress shirt, wearing glasses, clenched the paper handles of his shopping bag a little too tightly. His foot tapped the floor impatiently, an unspoken rhythm of his growing annoyance. His face carried the weary tension of someone with far too much to do, and the last thing he wanted was to waste time waiting for an incompetent cashier. The glances, the exasperated expressions, the increasingly audible sighs, they all piled onto Ethan like weights on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands, but the suffocating pressure only dragged him further down, making him feel smaller, clumsier, more out of place. And then, from a distance, standing motionless in the shifting tide of people, was a towering figure. Shaquille O'Neal, nearly 7 feet 1 inch tall, broad-shouldered and formidable, stood in quiet observation. No one paid him any attention, for he did nothing but stand there, hands tucked into the pockets of his gray hoodie, his deep-set eyes calm and contemplative. He had seen this scene unfold too many times, on the court, in everyday life, in the quiet corners of society where few ever looked. The doubtful glances, the whispered mockery, the way people enjoyed feeling superior to those who struggled, simply because they were faster, sharper, or armed with an excess of confidence. The silent crowds that watched but chose not to intervene. The ones who reveled in their small moments of power by tearing down someone weaker. Shaq watched, patient, unreadable, unmoving, because he knew the real storm hadn't come yet. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to stand by and watch for much longer. The automatic doors of Fresh Mart slid open silently, revealing the poised stride of a woman entering as if the entire space had been built solely to accommodate her. Amanda Brooks, 46 years old, her blonde hair neatly styled in soft waves, wore impeccably applied makeup, deep red lips, and piercing eyes. She was dressed in a sophisticated yet rigid designer outfit that exuded an air of distant exclusivity. From the moment she stepped in, Amanda's displeasure was evident. She gripped her luxury handbag tightly, swinging it with deliberate ostentation as she walked. Her brow arched slightly at the sight of the crowded store, lips pressing together in thinly veiled annoyance. Without any attempt to mask her irritation, she muttered to herself, loud enough for those around her to hear. Another exhausting shopping trip. They really should have a VIP service for people as important as me. No one responded. No employee dared to display any reaction beyond silent compliance. Customers like Amanda were not uncommon. People who entered a shared space yet acted as if they were the center of the universe. Those who viewed waiting as an insult to their status. Those who saw employees not as human beings, but as mere instruments to serve their needs. Amanda pushed her cart forward, gripping the handle firmly, but without any gentleness. Every movement carried an unnecessary urgency, her impatience manifesting in the smallest gestures. As she passed, an elderly woman bent over to select oranges. Amanda did not slow down, did not step aside. She simply shoved past, her shoulder knocking into the woman with enough force to send a few oranges rolling across the tiled floor. The older woman stiffened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. But when she looked up and met Amanda's cold, imperious gaze, she merely sighed, quietly crouching down to pick up her fallen oranges without uttering a word. Amanda did not look back, as if the incident had never happened, as if it were too insignificant to warrant her attention. She continued striding down the aisles, her sharp eyes scanning the shelves, not searching for what she needed, but rather inspecting for anything in the store that might justify a complaint. Ahead, a young employee was restocking shelves, inadvertently standing in her path. Without a moment's hesitation, Amanda lifted her chin and spoke, her voice laced with entitlement and impatience. "Hey, move aside. I don't have all day for you to finish cleaning up." The young employee flinched, hastily stepping aside, her hands clenching slightly as she lowered her gaze, unwilling to invite trouble. Amanda, as if oblivious to the existence of anyone around her, continued pushing her cart straight toward the checkout counters. The rhythmic clack of her heels echoed against the tiles, each step a deliberate assertion of her superiority over everyone present. At the checkout area, Amanda paused briefly, her sharp gaze sweeping over each counter, evaluating the cashiers as though she were assessing their efficiency. Then she honed in on register number 5, where Ethan was working. It didn't take long for her to notice the slight awkwardness in his movements. Another cashier might have scanned and bagged groceries with practiced ease, but Ethan was still careful in a way that bordered on clumsy. That alone was enough to irk Amanda. She shoved her cart forward forcefully, accidentally nudging the customer ahead of her. But rather than offering an apology, she simply folded her arms and tilted her head, scrutinizing Ethan with thinly veiled disdain. Within seconds, she exhaled dramatically. "Can you hurry up? I don't have all day." Her voice was sharp and icy, not a request but a command, a declaration that everything should revolve around her convenience. Ethan flinched slightly, his fingers instinctively tightening around the counter's edge. His breaths shortened, but he pushed himself to remain composed, determined to pick up his pace. Yet, under the weight of Amanda's scrutinizing gaze, one filled with nothing but contempt, his movements grew even more unsteady. As he reached for a carton of milk from the conveyor belt, it slipped from his grasp and hit the floor with a dull thud, the sound cutting through the increasingly tense silence. For a fleeting moment, the store seemed to hold its breath, but Amanda's reaction was swift and merciless. She blinked once, tilting her head slightly, before letting out a quiet, disdainful chuckle, a smile devoid of any warmth. My God, he can't even hold a carton of milk. Her words dripped with mockery, spoken loudly enough for those nearby to hear. A few customers began murmuring amongst themselves. Others simply remained silent, their gazes shifting toward Ethan, unwittingly adding to the weight pressing down on him. From Register 4, Jason heard every word. His lips curled slightly into a knowing smirk. He didn't say anything. He merely exchanged a glance with Rachel, as if confirming that this was exactly what he had expected. Ethan quickly bent down to pick up the fallen carton, trying to steady his breath. But inside, his thoughts were already spiraling, doubt creeping in, chipping away at what little confidence he had left. Further away, between the neatly arranged shelves, Shaquille O'Neal remained still, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. His jaw tightened slightly, his deep-set gaze sharpening with quiet resolve, because he knew the real confrontation had yet to begin. The sound of the milk carton hitting the floor wasn't loud, but it rang out clearly in that moment, as if the entire space around them had frozen for a brief second before the tension surged. Ethan bent down to pick it up, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped it again. But before he could steady his breath and continue his work, a sharp, cold laugh echoed right in front of him. Amanda stood there with her arms crossed, tilting her head slightly, her eyes glinting with cruel amusement, as if she had just witnessed something so ridiculous it was beyond belief. The way she curled her lip in disgust made the already heavy atmosphere even more suffocating. Oh my God, he can't even hold a milk carton. The words weren't just a passing remark. They were a declaration of pure contempt, a ruthless judgment thrown out into the crowd with no hesitation, no restraint. People around them started paying attention. Some turned their heads, their gazes wavering between irritation at Amanda and uncertainty about how to react. Others simply bowed their heads, pretending not to hear, unwilling to get involved. No one spoke up. No one intervened. No one stood up for Ethan. Because in that moment, most of them chose the safety of silence. Ethan bit his lip, his fingers tightening around the carton, but he couldn't stop it from shaking. His breath hitched as an old buried wave of memories crashed over him, dragging him down before he could resist. The supermarket around him blurred. The shelves, the customers, the registers, everything fading into the background like a distant, unreachable reality. He was back in that old kitchen again. The dim ceiling light cast a dull glow over a battered wooden dining table, worn-out chairs, and in front of him stood a towering man with cold eyes and a sharp-edged stare filled with disdain. "You'll never amount to anything, you useless piece of trash." The voice wasn't Amanda's, but it cut just as deep, replaying in his mind like a broken tape he had tried so hard to bury. He saw himself as a child, curled up in that wooden chair, small hands clenched tightly around the hem of his pants, his head bowed to avoid meeting that searing, scornful gaze. He didn't dare protest, didn't dare speak, because every time he tried to explain, tried to defend himself, all he ever got in return was a mocking, cruel laugh. "Who do you think would ever hire someone like you? You think you can do anything other than be a burden to everyone around you?" That laughter still echoed in the back of his mind, merging with Amanda's icy tone, snapping him back to the present. But the shame, the trembling in his body, hadn't faded. He wanted to respond, wanted to say he wasn't a burden, wanted to stand up for himself, but his throat was dry, the words lodged somewhere deep inside, stuck in a place he couldn't reach. But Amanda wasn't done. She stood there, lips curling into a smirk, eyes alight with a twisted satisfaction, as if watching someone crumble before her gave her some kind of perverse power. "You should just stay home instead of slowing everyone else down. No one has time for you." The words hit like a hammer, shattering the fragile remnants of self-confidence Ethan had been desperately clinging to. His shoulders tensed, his fingers gripping the conveyor belt so hard his knuckles turned white, yet he couldn't stop his body from reacting instinctively to the cruelty. From checkout lane number 4, Jason watched silently, his eyes glinting with amusement as if he had been expecting this exact scene to unfold. He didn't say a word, just crossed his arms over his chest, his lips curling into a smirk. Next to him, Rachel lowered her head, her face tinged with unease, but she still said nothing. In the line, some customers began whispering among themselves. A few seemed uncomfortable with Amanda's behavior, but only shook their heads, unwilling to interfere. Others turned away, pretending not to notice. Only one middle-aged woman with short hair and a green coat frowned, her voice low but laced with frustration as she turned to the man beside her. "This is awful. He's just trying to do his job." The man sighed, his tone hesitant. "I know, but we don't want to get involved, do we?" And so, like always, like so many times before, the crowd did what they always did. Nothing. But amidst all the averted gazes, amidst all the hesitant downward glances, there was one pair of eyes locked onto Amanda. Cold, calculated. Shaquille O'Neal stood still, silent and unmoving, yet his presence alone was like an immovable wall between the injustice unfolding before him. He didn't need to step forward. He didn't need to speak. But the mere weight of his existence was enough to make the air around the checkout lanes feel heavier, like the brewing edge of an oncoming storm. His jaw clenched slightly, his hand tightening into a fist inside the pocket of his hoodie. His breaths were slow but heavy. He had seen this before, too many times. He had witnessed too many people like Amanda, the ones who thrived on belittling others, who believed they had the right to tear people down simply because no one ever stopped them. But he stayed where he was, waiting, watching, seeing if anyone would break the silence first, if anyone would step forward, or if, once again, everyone would do what they always did, turn away and let cruelty run unchecked. He knew he wouldn't stand by for much longer, but he was waiting, because the real storm had yet to break. The atmosphere in the supermarket grew thick, tension hanging in the air between the people standing in silent observation. Some lowered their heads to avoid the scene, while others only dared to watch without uttering a single word. The beeping of barcode scanners and the hushed conversations at nearby counters seemed muffled, as if everything around had faded to make way for this moment. Ethan kept his head down, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But the trembling wasn't just from Amanda's pressure. It was from something deeper, something familiar. A fear he had spent years trying to escape, only for it to return now, drowning him in old memories of helplessness and the pain of being disregarded. Amanda stood there, arms crossed over her chest, her gaze sweeping past Ethan as if he were nothing more than an invisible obstacle, an inconvenience that irritated her, but wasn't worth any more of her time. She tilted her chin up, sighed dramatically, and let her red-painted lips curl into a smirk full of contempt, her voice sharp and laced with mockery. "He shouldn't be working here if he can't do it properly. I have no obligation to be patient with people like this." The words came out cold, without hesitation or remorse, as if in Amanda's eyes, Ethan wasn't a human with emotions, wasn't someone trying his best, just a roadblock standing in the way of her perfect shopping experience. And the moment her words faded, another voice cut through the tension. A deep, steady voice, warm but firm, shattering the suffocating weight of helplessness in the air. "That's enough." The voice wasn't loud, yet it carried enough weight to make everyone in the checkout area turn their heads, as if gravity itself had shifted, as if those present had just realized the presence of something far more powerful than Amanda's cruel words. Shaquille O'Neal was no longer standing still. He stepped forward, his movements slow but commanding, his towering figure immediately drawing the absolute attention of everyone in the supermarket. His sharp gaze remained calm, his expression serious but devoid of anger, only a quiet certainty, the certainty of someone who had witnessed too much injustice in life and had no intention of letting it continue before his eyes. Amanda blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but she quickly masked it. She straightened her posture, tilted her head slightly, arms still folded, forcing herself to maintain an air of arrogant composure, as if Shaq's presence didn't rattle her at all. "And who do you think you are, butting into this?" Her voice no longer carried the same absolute confidence as before, but it still held enough defiance to show that she was unaccustomed to being challenged, unaccustomed to someone daring to stand against her. Shaq didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, looking directly into Amanda's eyes. His gaze wasn't filled with fury, but it carried a weight that made anyone facing it feel the instinct to take a step back. But Amanda didn't step back. She stood her ground, though her arms, still crossed over her chest, began to tighten ever so slightly. As if, for the first time, she sensed a real confrontation. After a few heavy seconds of silence, Shaq finally spoke, his voice steady and resolute, every word deliberate, carrying an undeniable weight. "I'm someone who knows that no one deserves to be treated that way." The statement was simple, but carried the force of an unshakable truth. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an attack. It was a reality, one that everyone in the supermarket understood but had been too afraid to say aloud. Silence took over. The customers nearby were all now focused entirely on Shaq, some surprised, others seeming relieved that, at last, someone had spoken up. At checkout counter number 4, Jason remained still, the smug smirk he had worn earlier, now long gone, replaced with a look of quiet observation, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. Rachel, who had remained silent all this time, unconsciously held her breath, as if witnessing something she never expected to see. Amanda narrowed her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features before she quickly composed herself. "I'm just stating a fact. He's too slow, and I have no obligation to stand here waiting." Her voice was still cold, but anyone paying close attention could tell that the force behind her words had weakened. For the first time since she walked into the supermarket, Amanda was no longer in full control of the situation. Shaq gave a small nod as if he had expected this response, but his gaze never wavered from Amanda's. Not for a second. You have the right to be frustrated. You have the right to want things to move faster. But you don't have the right to humiliate someone just because they're not working the way you want them to." His words weren't just for Amanda. They were for everyone who had been watching, for those who had seen the cruelty yet chosen silence, for those who had heard the sharp words but had been too afraid to speak against them. And they were for Ethan, the young man standing behind the checkout counter, his eyes still clouded with hurt, but now holding something else when they met Shaq's, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Shaq didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten, but the calm certainty in his tone held more power than any outburst ever could. It wasn't just a protest, it was a declaration, a firm refusal to let this injustice continue any longer. And, for the first time since stepping into the supermarket, Amanda didn't know how to respond. Amanda blinked, her smug smile faltering for a split second before she quickly regained her usual composure. She crossed her arms over her chest, her cold, calculating gaze sweeping over Shaquille O'Neal, as if he were just another player stepping into a game she had already won. She scoffed, drawing out her words with a barely concealed disdain. "I'm just stating the truth. He can't do this job." The words, sharp as a needle, struck Ethan right where it hurt the most, piercing through the insecurities he had carried his entire life, reopening old wounds of rejection, of being underestimated, of being forced to believe that he wasn't good enough to survive in a world that played by rules he had never been taught. Shaq didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward register number 5. Each movement was steady, unhurried, and devoid of anger, yet carried a weight so undeniable that the very air in the supermarket seemed to shift. When he finally stopped beside Ethan, it was as if every eye in the store had turned toward him, drawn into an unspoken confrontation. This was no longer just between Amanda and Ethan. Another force had entered the arena, one too immense to be ignored. Shaq lowered himself slightly, his towering frame tilting just enough to look Ethan in the eye. There was no pity in his gaze, no scrutiny, only an unwavering acknowledgement, a quiet but powerful affirmation that Ethan was here, doing his job, standing exactly where he had every right to stand, just like anyone else. Then, in a simple but profound gesture, Shaq placed a massive yet reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. The touch, though subtle, carried the weight of absolute protection. "He's doing his job, and you're trying to humiliate him." Shaq's voice was calm, devoid of hostility, yet each word landed with an inarguable force. No one in the supermarket could ignore it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Customers waiting in line exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from passive bystanders to something more aware. A few nodded slightly, as if finally recognizing a truth that had been there all along, one they hadn't dared to acknowledge. Amanda had no legitimate reason to say what she did. Further down the line, a young woman subtly raised her phone, tilting it for a better angle. Beside her, a middle-aged man hesitated for only a moment before taking out his own phone, silently deciding this was worth recording. Amanda, sensing the shift in the room, stiffened. A flicker of impatience crossed her sharp features as if she could feel control slipping from her grasp. "I'm not humiliating anyone," she snapped, her voice a notch higher now, an attempt to reclaim the crowd. "I'm just saying he's not capable of doing this job. If someone isn't performing well, people have the right to complain." She was trying to reframe the argument, trying to remind everyone that she was simply telling the truth. But this time, silence wasn't on her side. A voice rose from the back of the line, steady and firm. There's a difference between complaining and deliberately trying to tear someone down. All heads turned toward the speaker, a middle-aged woman with short, curly hair and a no-nonsense expression that still held warmth and empathy. She stood tall, arms crossed, staring Amanda down without a trace of hesitation. A few others nodded in agreement. Then, a man in a blue button-down shirt spoke up. "We've all been waiting. No one's complaining except you." Those words, those reactions, chipped away at Amanda's dominance, flipping the dynamic. No longer the one controlling the conversation, she now found herself in the position of having to justify her actions. Her gaze darted around the supermarket, searching for support, for someone willing to back her up. But the people who had once stood silent were now looking at her differently. The power she had wielded moments ago had started to dissolve. Shaq remained where he was, unmoving. He didn't need to say anything more. Amanda's own words and actions had exposed the truth to everyone. All he had to do was stand his ground. He met her eyes, his voice steady and unshakable. "You have the right to complain, but you don't have the right to tear someone down just because you're impatient." Every pair of eyes in the store landed on Amanda, and for the first time since she walked in, she felt outnumbered. There were no nods of agreement this time, no silent permission for her to continue twisting the situation in her favor. Instead, there were assessing looks, raised phones capturing the moment, and people who were now firmly standing with Ethan. And just like that, the tide had turned. The atmosphere in the supermarket had completely shifted. The oppressive silence was gone, as were the averted gazes and hesitant nods. In their place was an invisible movement, a collective awakening among people who had grown accustomed to staying out of things. But now, faced with such blatant injustice, they could no longer remain passive. Shaquille O'Neal stood tall, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. He saw the change in their faces, the growing determination in their gazes, and he knew this was the moment to turn that shift into real action. He took a slow breath, his deep voice steady yet powerful, each word resonating not just with Amanda, but with everyone present. "If anyone here thinks this isn't right, then don't stay silent." His words were like a quiet command, yet they carried immense weight. Like a spark catching on dry grass, they ignited something within the crowd, something that could no longer be ignored. Immediately, a firm voice rang out from the checkout line. "I agree. No one deserves to be treated like that." All heads turned toward the voice, a middle-aged woman with short silver hair. She was small in stature, but her eyes blazed with conviction. She stepped forward, facing Amanda without fear or hesitation. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried undeniable strength, the kind that came from someone who knew, deep down, that injustice should never go unchallenged. Then, another voice joined in. A man standing nearby spoke, his tone calm yet unwavering, his gaze no longer uncertain as it landed on Amanda. "We're all waiting too, and no one's complaining except for you." The agreement spread like a domino effect. Another woman, young, with her brown hair tied back, raised her hand high, her voice clear and strong. "He's just doing his job. If anyone is holding things up, it's you, not him." All eyes were now on Amanda. For the first time since stepping into the supermarket, she was no longer at the center of support she had taken for granted. No longer the one who controlled the conversation. She could feel the shift in the way people looked at her, the growing coldness in faces that had once been indifferent or hesitant. She was losing control. Her hands clenched into fists, her shoulders tensed, and though she struggled to maintain an air of confidence, Shaq's sharp eyes caught every flicker of uncertainty in her expression. Amanda's gaze darted around as if searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But those who might have once sided with her were now looking at her with detachment. No one wanted to be dragged into this with her. No one was willing to stand by her anymore because they all knew they had been siding with the wrong person. A slow-burning frustration swelled in Amanda's chest. She couldn't believe this was happening. What had started as a simple request, a customer asking for faster service, had somehow turned into a confrontation between her and an entire crowd. "This is ridiculous. You're all overreacting. All I asked for was better service, and now I'm the villain." Her voice rose, sharper, more defensive. But instead of regaining control, she only fueled the irritation around her. A middle-aged man standing nearby crossed his arms and shook his head, his voice laced with quiet sarcasm. "No, you're not asking for better service. You're just trying to make a young man feel worthless because you don't have the patience to wait." Shaq remained where he was, silent but resolute. He didn't need to say much. The crowd was speaking for him now. Ethan stood there, eyes wide, taking in the scene. Moments ago, these people had been silent bystanders. Now, they were standing up for him, and in his chest, something unfamiliar stirred, something like hope, something like validation. Amanda gripped the strap of her handbag tightly, her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. But this time, she had no rebuttal, no way to overpower the atmosphere that had completely turned against her. And, for the first time, she felt isolated in the very place where she had once believed she held power. The feeling of isolation wrapped around Amanda like an invisible net tightening around her, making it impossible to breathe. The gazes she once believed would support her, the people she thought would stand on the side of her so-called righteousness, were now looking at her with distance, discomfort, and even contempt. No one averted their eyes awkwardly anymore. No one pretended to be busy to avoid her gaze. They all stood there, no longer willing to accept the arrogance and tyranny she had imposed on someone weaker. She darted a glance at Shaq, but the way he stood, tall, unwavering, unshaken, made her realize she could not win this confrontation. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten her. His very presence was enough to crush the arrogance she had been deluding herself with for so long. Her jaw tightened, teeth clenching as she struggled to keep her anger from clouding her judgment. But it was difficult to remain composed when she had just realized she had lost. She couldn't bear the feeling of being surrounded by people she had always considered beneath her, nor could she accept the fact that she had completely lost control. Her eyes flickered around the room once more, desperately searching for even a single sympathetic glance, one last shred of support. But all she found was the heavy silence of those she had once dismissed, now filled with nothing but disdain. Her grip tightened around the strap of her designer bag, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and bewilderment, as if she were still trying to find a way to turn the situation around. But this time, there was no way out. She had lost every ounce of control she once held. Refusing to accept defeat in this humiliating manner, Amanda lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and let out a sharp, cutting voice, high-pitched yet laced with bitterness and desperation rather than confidence. "I don't need this pathetic supermarket." Her voice burned with anger, but no one missed the faint tremor beneath it, as if she were clinging to the last remnants of authority she no longer possessed. Yet no one reacted. No one tried to stop her. No one attempted to de-escalate the situation the way she had expected. No one cared anymore. And the moment Amanda realized that, she knew she had lost. She spun on her heel, storming toward the exit, the sharp clicks of her high heels echoing across the floor with each heavy step. A silent rage still burned in her chest, but for the first time in her life, she had no one left to unleash it on. No one watched her with admiration. No one stood by her side. No one held her back. And that was more painful than any argument or opposition. The automatic doors of the supermarket slid open. The sound of her footsteps faded into the vast space beyond, and then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd outside, leaving behind an eerie silence, as if everyone was still processing what had just happened. A quiet breath escaped from the customers. A few still looked stunned by how quickly everything had shifted. And then, suddenly, one person, the middle-aged woman who had spoken up earlier, began to clap. The sound cut through the silence like a spark catching onto dry grass. Almost immediately, another person clapped, then another. And then the applause erupted, spreading like a wave, filling the supermarket with recognition, gratitude, and support. For Ethan, for Shaq, and for everyone who had stood up for what was right. Ethan, still standing behind the checkout counter, lifted his head, eyes widening as he took in the warm smiles directed at him, the nods of acknowledgement as if they were all telling him, "You're not alone." For the first time in a long time, Ethan no longer felt invisible. The applause still echoed through the vast space of the supermarket, spreading like a warm wave that swept over everyone present. Faces that had once been strangers now glowed with empathetic smiles, eyes filled with genuine respect. Not the pitying looks Ethan had grown so accustomed to, but true recognition. He had stood tall through a storm he never thought he could endure, and for the first time in his life, he no longer felt small or invisible in the crowd. Shaquille O'Neal still stood beside him, towering and steadfast like an unshakable fortress. But this time, his presence was no longer just about shielding Ethan. It was about helping him see the true strength within himself. He didn't need anyone to protect him anymore because he had just realized that he deserved to stand here, with no shame and no fear. Shaq lowered himself slightly, his gaze softening, yet retaining the same unwavering steadiness. His voice was deep and warm, carrying an undeniable weight, a truth that could not be ignored. "You did great. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Ethan looked up at the man before him, his eyes reflecting gratitude but also something else, something that felt a lot like pride. He still couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The words of support, the applause, the strangers who had stood up for him. But deep inside, something new was beginning to grow. The feeling of being seen, of being valued, of belonging to this world without having to hide or be afraid. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but instead, he simply took a deep breath. To feel the air fill in his lungs, to feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a reminder that he was here, that he existed, that he was growing stronger with each passing second. A customer, the middle-aged woman who had spoken up earlier, stepped forward, her smile gentle yet resolute. "You did amazing, Ethan. Never let anyone make you believe you're not good enough, because you are a part of this community, and we need people like you." Her words touched something deep inside him, a part of his soul he had spent so long trying to bury, a part of him that had grown used to shrinking away, to telling himself he wasn't good enough, not fast enough, not smart enough to truly belong among the people out there. But now, as he looked around, as he saw the eyes that met his with genuine respect, he realized that maybe, all this time, he had been underestimating himself. A man standing nearby nodded, his voice steady and firm. "You did your job, and you did it well. That's what really matters." A young woman, still holding her phone, let out a small laugh, her voice light but unable to hide her admiration. "Ethan, you just reminded all of us that kindness and patience still exist in this world, and that is something truly worth appreciating." Ethan blinked, as if trying to absorb it all, every word, every look, every smile. He had never thought he could make any kind of impact on anyone, had never imagined he could inspire others. But now, standing here, surrounded by people who supported him, the feeling was undeniably real. Shaq gave him a light pat on the shoulder, a simple gesture carrying profound encouragement. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself, and you don't need to prove anything to people who aren't worth it. Just keep working, keep living, keep moving forward, because the world needs people like you." Ethan didn't say anything, but this time the smile on his face was no longer hesitant or uncertain. It was real. It was confident. It was the smile of a man who had just found himself again. As the atmosphere in the supermarket gradually settled, as the tension dissipated and gave way to smiles and nods of appreciation toward Ethan, something unexpected was quietly unfolding. A young customer who had instinctively raised their phone to record the entire confrontation between Amanda and Shaquille O'Neal, between injustice and courage, quickly uploaded the video to social media. At first, it was just a short clip, but what it contained was more powerful than any words could describe. The video opened with Amanda standing at the checkout counter, her voice cold and dripping with contempt, slicing through the air like an unrelenting judgment against Ethan. "He's not fast enough, not good enough. He shouldn't be working this job." The camera wobbled slightly as the person filming tried to steady their grip. Then came the moment when Shaquille O'Neal stepped forward, his towering presence firm beside Ethan. His deep yet resolute voice echoed, completely dismantling everything Amanda had just declared. "He's doing his job, and you're trying to humiliate him." Those words, spoken in mere seconds, changed the entire narrative. The person filming didn't miss the most crucial moments. When Shaq locked eyes with Amanda, when customers began standing up for Ethan one by one, when voices rose in unison against injustice, and finally, the image of Amanda storming out in frustration, alone, without a single supporter, became the defining symbol of the entire event. Within hours of being posted, the video began spreading like wildfire. Comments flooded every social media platform, from Facebook and Twitter to TikTok and Instagram. Shares poured in by the thousands, then millions. People expressed outrage at Amanda's behavior, but more than anything, they admired Shaq's bravery and Ethan's quiet resilience. Those who had never heard of Ethan before now spoke his name with respect. People who had experienced discrimination, who had been overlooked, who had been told they weren't good enough, saw themselves reflected in this story. Countless posts shared the video. Countless captions voiced support. And then, something inevitable happened. The hashtags number respect for Ethan and number kindness. Matters became a global trend. Strangers from all over the world began rallying behind Ethan. They didn't just share the story, they shared their own experiences. Moments when they too had been underestimated, treated unfairly, or subjected to the same kind of cruelty Ethan had faced. Celebrities took notice. Advocacy groups for disability rights, communities promoting kindness and social justice. Everyone spoke up, making it clear that no one had the right to belittle another human being simply because they were different. In a world saturated with negativity, a story about courage, solidarity, and the power of kindness became a beacon of inspiration for millions. Ethan, a young man who had only ever wanted a simple job, suddenly became a symbol of perseverance, inner strength, and triumph over adversity. And even as the spotlight unexpectedly shone on him, even as the world outside suddenly knew his name, Ethan remained Ethan. He continued his work, carefully and diligently, but this time he did it with a newfound confidence, because for the first time in his life, he knew he was no longer standing alone. The next morning, the bright sunlight streamed through the large glass windows of Fresh Mart, casting a warm glow over everything as if heralding a fresh beginning. The atmosphere was just as bustling as any other day. The sound of shopping carts rolling across the tiled floor, customers chatting, barcode scanners beeping rhythmically, but something felt undeniably different from yesterday. Ethan stepped through the main entrance, his uniform neat and tidy, his slightly wavy brown hair still carrying a few strands out of place. But this time, his steps were steady, free of the hesitation and nervousness that had once weighed him down. He wasn't quite sure what to call this feeling. Perhaps a sense of relief, a newfound confidence, or maybe even a quiet joy he never thought he would experience. As he walked towards the checkout area, an elderly woman standing nearby, her kind eyes twinkling and her smile gentle, raised a hand and waved softly. "Ethan, you did great." He stopped for a second, his eyes widening in surprise, but almost immediately a warm smile spread across his face. He bowed his head slightly in gratitude, feeling a surge of warmth rush through him. It was as if yesterday's events weren't just a fleeting moment, but had truly left a lasting impact on the people around him. And the words of encouragement didn't stop there. As he reached his register, a middle-aged man in a well-tailored suit, probably an office worker, stepped forward, placing his shopping bag on the counter before looking at Ethan with an earnest smile. "Hey, young man, you've inspired a lot of people. Keep up the good work." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond other than offering a grateful nod, because for the first time in his life, he felt like more than just a cashier. He felt like he was a meaningful part of this community. Then, a young woman, likely the one who had recorded the video yesterday, approached with an excited gleam in her eyes. "Ethan, do you know? Your video's going viral everywhere. Everyone's talking about you, even Shaquille O'Neal. People want you to know that you deserve this job, and you don't have to change for anyone." Ethan blinked, an unfamiliar sensation stirring within him. He had never imagined that he could touch people's hearts, let alone become a symbol of perseverance and fairness. But at this moment, seeing these genuine smiles and hearing these heartfelt words of support, he knew he had truly made a difference. From a distance, store manager Mark Simmons was observing everything from behind the customer service counter, a satisfied smile forming on his face. He had always known that Ethan was hard-working and dedicated, but he hadn't expected that a difficult situation would turn into an opportunity for Ethan to shine. Jason, the coworker who had sneered at Ethan just the day before, was there too. But this time, he didn't dare say a word. He simply looked at Ethan with an odd expression, perhaps a mix of shame, jealousy, and something that almost resembled acceptance. Rachel, the colleague who had always been hesitant, gave Ethan a small smile and nodded as he glanced her way. She didn't say anything, but her eyes had changed. No longer filled with doubt, they now carried something else. Respect. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a newfound steadiness within him. He no longer felt out of place like he had on his first day here. He was no longer afraid of judgmental stares or whispers behind his back. Today, he stood here not just because this was his job, but because he belonged here. Because he had proven that he could do this without having to change himself to please anyone. He gently placed his hand on the barcode scanner, looking towards his first customer of the day with a genuine, unwavering smile. One free of hesitation or fear. A new day had begun, and for Ethan, it was more than just another ordinary day. It was a day that reaffirmed that there was a place for him in this world, that kindness and fairness still existed, as long as someone had the courage to stand up and fight for them. Shaquille O'Neal stood near the cash register for a long moment after everything had settled down, quietly watching Ethan work with a calmness mixed with satisfaction. Gone were the scrutinizing eyes, the fear lingering in the young man's every movement, the skeptical glances or the snide remarks thrown his way. Instead, there were smiles, warm gazes, and nods of recognition, the kind Ethan had deserved all along. He had seen enough. No more words were needed, no further actions required. This battle was over, and, more importantly, Ethan had won, not just against Amanda, but against his own fears. Shaq turned and strode toward the exit, his broad shoulders blending into the vast space of the supermarket. He didn't seek gratitude, nor did he need recognition, because he hadn't stood up for fame or applause. He did it because it was the right thing to do. A store employee noticed him leaving and murmured something to a coworker, but no one stopped him. They knew that people like Shaq didn't need the spotlight to do something great. As the automatic doors slid open, a gentle breeze swept in, carrying a quiet sense of peace. He had arrived like a powerful wave, washing away injustice, and left like a silent current, steady and unstoppable. But what mattered most wasn't his departure. It was the lesson he left behind. Because one action can change someone's entire life. Yesterday, Ethan had walked into his shift burdened with pressure and self-doubt. Today, he stood stronger than ever. Not because things had suddenly become easier, but because he now knew he wasn't alone. He knew there were people willing to stand up for what was right. He knew he belonged here, not out of pity, but because he deserved it. Amanda was gone, but what lingered wasn't the fear she once instilled in him. Instead, it was a lesson. The stark contrast between those who use strength to tear others down and those who use it to lift others up. Because true strength isn't found in muscles. It's found in the heart. The heart that speaks out against injustice. The heart that stands with the weak, even when the world turns away. The heart that doesn't need to prove anything, yet changes everything through its actions. And perhaps, yesterday, in just one fleeting moment inside a supermarket, a small act of kindness and courage didn't just change Ethan's life. It changed the lives of those who witnessed it, teaching them a lesson they would never forget. Today's story is a powerful reminder that a single action can spark a massive change. When we choose to stand up for what is right, to push back against injustice, we don't just help one person, we inspire an entire community. Ethan didn't need pity. He just needed a chance to prove his worth. And thanks to the bravery of Shaquille O'Neal and those willing to speak up, he found his confidence and belief in himself once more. What do you think about this story? If you've ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. If you enjoy stories about kindness, justice, and the power of unity, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading these positive messages to more people. Remember, even the smallest action can change a life. Will you choose to stand up or stay silent?